Hi, everybody, and welcome. As people are coming in and joining us, my name is Jen Elder. I'm the director of the SAMHSA Homeless and Housing Resource Center, and we have a fantastic panel planned for you today about youth experiencing homelessness and serious emotional disturbance. Next slide. This webinar, the HHRC, is operated by Policy Research. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, but the views and opinions expressed today by all of the panelists are our own and do not reflect official policy of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. So I will give a few housekeeping instructions before we kick off the great content today. We are joined by 2 American Sign Language interpreters, and we have live captioning by a human captioner. So we greatly appreciate them for sharing their expertise with us today. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to our team or put a note in the Q&A, and we will reach back out and get you all sorted. Next slide. All participant lines will be muted today, and the chat feature is disabled. As you'll see, we're going to be joined by a pretty large group, so those things are turned off for today, but we want to hear from you. So we received hundreds of questions before the webinar. The panelists have reviewed those, and there'll be a Q&A section in the last 30 minutes or so of today's presentation. But we want to keep hearing from you today. So please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to send us your questions, to send us your feedback. If something is really hitting the mark, let us know. Our panelists can see that, and that's your way to communicate with them. The slides are available now on the HHRC website. Alicia's put the link in the chat, and we'll make sure everybody has that. We'll have a recording available on the HHRC website soon. And then at the end of the webinar, you should be redirected to an evaluation and then a certificate of participation once you complete that. Next slide. So with that, I am going to hand things over to our moderator today, Dr. Vanessa Schick, who's going to walk us through the presentation and introduce our panelists. Take it.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So delighted that you were able to join us here today for what I'm hopeful will be a fantastic panel. We have 3 great speakers joining us who are really national experts in this space and come from 3 different but complementary perspectives around the issue. I hope you'll really enjoy hearing from and learning from them as much as I will. To get us started today, we have Nicholas Barr joining us. Dr. Barr is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Comparative Religion from Columbia University and his MSW at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Barr then worked as a clinical social worker for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health for 2 years before completing his PhD at the University of Southern California School of Social Work. Dr. Barr's research focuses on enhancing understanding of risk and protective factors for populations with an elevated likelihood of traumatic experiences like homeless young adults and military service members. His work includes intervention development and implementation leveraging principles of mindfulness to enhance resilience and improve mental and behavioral health outcomes in these populations. He holds certifications in a number of evidence-based practices, including prolonged exposure and cognitive behavior therapy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barr.
Great, thank you very much. We can go ahead and advance this first slide here. Thank you. So just very briefly, let me set a little bit of an agenda for us here. So I'll begin by talking about the scope and key drivers of youth and young adult homelessness before transitioning into youth and young adult homelessness mental health issues, including prevalence, risk and protective factors, and related behavioral health outcomes. Then I'll talk a little bit about intervention approaches and share kind of a brief clinical anecdote about a client that I work with. And we'll wrap up with some takeaways. So thanks again for joining us today. We can go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so a little bit on how we come to use this term, youth and young adult homelessness. How do we assess the scope of this issue and get our hands around the parameters of the problem? So there are several different ways that folks try to pin down the number of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. Probably the most often quoted numbers come from the youth point in time counts. So the point in time counts are funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is the body that sort of oversees the largest tranche of federal funding devoted to homelessness issues. And so as part of this point in time count, over 1 or 2 days, cities will actually go out and try to visually count the number of folks that they see who are appearing to be experiencing homelessness. And youth counts are part of that effort. Now, for all of these, including the point in time count, we're really just looking at a snapshot. And so most folks agree that these are probably undercounts of folks actually experiencing homelessness. The point in time count uses a narrower definition, which is literal, for the most part, literal homelessness, meaning the person is unsheltered, living on the street, or in a place that's unfit for human habitation. Other efforts, though, have a bit of a broader definition. So the McKinney-Vento Act is an act that allows public schools to collect data around student needs, including youth and students experiencing homelessness. It's a little bit of a broader definition. So we get some more data from McKinney-Vento Act reporting. Starting in 2021, there's also the nationally representative Youth Behavior Risk Survey. This also includes an item on housing instability. And then various other organizations like Chapin Hall, for example, do their own well-funded count efforts. So the point of this is that there's a variety of sources of data that we use to track the numbers of youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, but they are probably all undercounts. So that's the big takeaway here from this slide. We can go ahead to the next slide. So looking at some recent prevalence estimates from the National Council of State Legislators that sort of compiles all of these various data sources that we saw on the previous slide, the current estimates are that around 4 million youth and young adults in the United States will experience homelessness at some point. This is a huge number. Around 700,000 are or will be unaccompanied minors. And then if we're looking at probabilities here, 1 in 10 young people are likely to experience homelessness, ages 18 to 25. 1 in 30 are likely to experience or are experiencing homelessness, ages 12 to 17. So we can see that risk for experiencing homelessness goes up as youth and young adults transition into the age of independence. And there's some graphs here on the bottom looking at, there's a graph here on the bottom looking at kind of age breakdowns and differentiating between explicit homelessness, meaning being street-based with no shelter, and couch surfing, so kind of bouncing around, staying with friends. And we see youth often do this. Most folks will do everything they can to avoid having to sleep out on the street. We can go ahead and advance the next slide here. So looking at some key drivers now behind these numbers. So what are some of the key drivers that account for homelessness? Well, this is probably not a surprise to folks, but the #1 key driver is poverty and lack of affordable housing. So if there's one main takeaway, I think that's really critical to take from my talk today, it's that no matter what we do, unless we improve folks' economic and material conditions and provide for more affordable housing, we simply will not be able to solve this problem, okay? It's inextricably linked to poverty and lack of affordable housing. So just to put a number on this, the federal poverty rate for an individual is about $15,000 a year. For a family of four, it's $32,000. So there is no state, no city in the country where you can afford a market rate apartment making this amount of money, or even 30% more than this amount of money. Okay, so folks who are rent burdened, according to HUD's definition, are spending more than 30% or 30% of their income on housing. And that essentially describes every working person who's 18 and up in the country, who's making, even more than this amount of money. So inextricably linked to poverty and lack of affordable housing. But there are also other drivers. So one would be family conflict. And this is a multidimensional issue. It includes things like poverty, parental mental health challenges, sexual or physical abuse. And we know from the research data that caregiver substance use and depression predict housing insecurity. So we can start to get at how there is a constellation of factors driving some of this risk, right? Where you have families that are stressed economically, you have parents that are trying to manage that stress, but maybe using substances or experiencing some mental health challenges of their own. And this contributes to risk for the youth or young adult becoming homeless. So some other drivers are things like foster care and juvenile justice system exits. So research shows that up to a third of homeless young adults are former foster youth. It's very challenging to exit the foster care system and be economically and socially independent. That's very, very challenging, and we see that we're not doing enough here to assist in that transition. And then another major driver is sexual minority status or LGBTQ plus status. So LGBTQ plus or sexual minority youth have a 120% higher risk of homelessness relative to their non-sexual minority youth peers. In some estimates, nearly a quarter of homeless youth are LGBTQ plus. I think it's very important to just state clearly at the outset that this is not some characteristic of these youth that makes them more likely to become homeless. It's because we have a society that continues to discriminate against these youth and contribute to their elevated risk for homelessness and mental health problems. So this is really a social and society problem where these youth are not accepted and getting the support that they need. So we have on the left here a graph. This line down the middle, the one, it is like basically no elevated risk or protection. So if you see something, for example, like not having a high school diploma or GED, this elevates the risk for homelessness significantly. Whereas at the top, being female lowers the risk just a little bit, okay? And then things that cross the barrier are really not significantly associated with risk. So low income, less than $24,000 a year associated with risk, as is that high school degree or diploma less than a high school degree or diploma, so low educational attainment, being an unmarried parent, and then we see also LGBTQ status. And we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, so moving now into mental health considerations. So we see disproportionately high rates of trauma exposure both prior to and during homelessness for youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness. So prior to becoming homeless, nearly a quarter, all the way up to potentially 66% of these youth experience some sort of physical or sexual abuse. Again, likely that this is an undercount, okay? So a really, really high probability of experiencing some sort of trauma prior to becoming homeless. Then, while homeless, 77% of youth and young adults report physical abuse, sexual abuse, or both. So this is during homelessness tenure. And while folks are on the street, they're at increased risk for victimization, for violence, and for abuse. So there really is this multi-directional pathway here where folks who are exposed to trauma and violence in the home are more likely to become homeless. But then while they're homeless, they're also at much, much higher risk for getting re-traumatized and re-victimized. So perhaps not surprising in this context, we have disproportionately high rates of mental health symptomology in this population compared to their housed peers. There are also individual and family mental health challenges that are both risk factors for homelessness and get worse when folks are homeless. And then finally, it's important to note that just being homeless in and of itself, even with no pre-existing mental health symptomology, is enough to drive the development of symptomology. It's extremely stressful physiologically and psychologically to be homeless. So prolonged experiences of homelessness are causally related to mental health symptom severity. They're enough to create that symptomology themselves. And we can go ahead to the next slide here. Okay, so the lifetime prevalence of mental health disorder in youth experiencing homelessness is between 2 times higher and 4 times higher than their housed peers. Okay, so much more likely to have some kind of mental health symptom burden in this population. Now, looking at a recent global meta-analysis of the most common types of mental health problems among youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, depression at 43%, this is lifetime prevalence. Post-traumatic stress disorder, nearly 1/3, anxiety and ADHD, nearly 1/4, and then 70% of the youth who were sampled had comorbid diagnoses, meaning more than one. We also see elevated rates of bipolar disorder, behavioral disorders, and psychotic disorders in this population. So the overall burden of mental health symptomology much higher in youth and young adults experiencing homelessness relative to their housed peers. And the longer the duration of homelessness, the more likely that we will see increased symptom severity and more diagnosable disorder. Okay, and we can go ahead to the next slide here. So some outcomes that are related to these mental health symptoms, one includes substance use. So it's important to say at the outset that a lot of folks will say, I think kind of in the popular culture that substance use is what is driving homelessness. And this is really not the case. So it really is this other constellation of factors, including poverty and lack of affordable housing, that are driving substance use. Of course, there are some folks that, their substance use is a major factor that accounts for their homelessness, but it's really the minority. It's much more common that folks use substances to cope with the trauma, mental health burden, and stress associated with being homeless. And just a little thought experiment. Think about how many people adults, youth, kids, who are using substances probably more than they should and are not homeless. Well, why aren't they? Well, they're stably housed and they probably have the material conditions and economic supports that prevent them from becoming homeless. So that being the case, still the prevalence of substance use in this population is very high, right? So studies show that between 70 to 90% use substances, but there's a lot of variability in this use. So the rates and types of substance use vary by gender. Young men are more likely to use harder drugs, and those who are homeless for longer tend to use more hard drugs. There are also network effects, right? Like all behaviors. So studies show that connections to more substance using peers raises the risk of substance use, just like it does with other risky behavior and pro-social behavior as well. So looking at some estimates here, current substance use, so recent substance use, research shows that in this population, about 37% are using alcohol, potentially problematically, about 30% are smoking cigarettes, about 45% are vaping currently, and about 32% are currently using marijuana, okay? So if we look at lifetime substance use, about 30% are using cocaine, 36%, have used cocaine, 36% have used methamphetamine, nearly 30% with heroin, ecstasy, MDMA, and injection drugs, as well as opioid misuse. If you compare this to the rates in housed youth, they're vastly higher. Housed youth are in the single-digit lifetime use rates for all of these categories, except for opioid misuse, which was around 13%, although this is declining. So far, far higher prevalence over the life course of hard drug use in youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. Again, mostly driven by the overall domain of risk that you experience when you're unhoused, and because it's really, really awful to be unhoused for a long period of time. So we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So some other outcomes linked to these mental health challenges that we need to touch on, and that's suicidality. So suicide is the leading cause of death in youth and young adults experiencing homelessness, the leading cause of death. Risk factors include sexual minority status. So LGBTQ youth are 2 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to their non-sexual minority counterparts. Gender, this mirrors the general population, where we are more likely to see attempts in young women and females, and more likely to see completions in young men and males. Also, trauma history and mental health challenges contribute to suicide risk. Maladaptive emotion regulation strategies, things like emotional suppression or substance use. Duration of homelessness is a contributor to suicidality, as is survival sex, using sex to obtain needed resources. So all of these risk factors contribute to driving this much, much higher risk of suicide that we see in this population. And you can imagine that many youth may share all of these characteristics. So you could have a youth who identifies as LGBTQ, who has a history of trauma, which they're likely to have if they've had street tenure. They may be using substances to try to cope with some of those experiences. They may have had to use survival sex to obtain necessary resources or to keep themselves physically safe. And so this constellation of factors contributes to drive this 2 times the risk for suicide compared to housed peers. So it's really, really a profound problem in this population. And we can go ahead and advance to the next slide here. So looking at some suicide risk data in a little bit greater detail. So some estimates from the recent Youth Behavior Risk Survey data show that over the lifetime, around 44% of these youth will demonstrate some suicide ideation, having thoughts of suicide. Nearly the same amount will make a suicide plan, which is not what we see in housed youth. Ideation might be high, but planning is typically much lower. We don't have that here. And then nearly 30% will attempt suicide over the life course, just an astonishingly high risk for suicide here. Estimates from other studies over the life course suggest that between 40 and 80% may have suicide ideation, and that the percentage who have had an attempt can vary between 23 and 67%. So depending on the kind of study that you're looking at, there's a lot of range in these estimates, but they're all high. And we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So transitioning now to talk about some protective factors. So these are divided into internal and external protective factors. So some internal protective factors are things like self-esteem, having robust emotion regulation strategies, things like problem solving, being able to talk to a friend and get support and validation. Things like mindfulness are also associated with better emotion regulation outcomes. Having positive peers and connections to caring and supportive adults sustained over time, and a subjective sense of well-being. These are all internal factors that are associated with better mental health outcomes and lower risk for suicide. External factors, though, are critically important. Nobody's going to self-esteem their way out of homelessness. We need to address the external factors that are driving the problem. And those are things like providing high-quality housing that's affordable and available, having material needs met. So youth are getting good nutrition, they're getting good sleep, their medical needs are met, they have adequate resources, educational attainment, and a strong social support network. These are external factors that we simply have to address if we want to improve mental health outcomes in this population. No amount of internal work will allow someone to be healthy living on the street for a sustained amount of time. And we can go ahead to the next slide here. So thinking about intervention approaches, there are a range of intervention approaches that are appropriate depending on youth's diagnostic picture. So things like cognitive behavior therapy in the research literature with this population is associated with reductions in depression and substance use problems. Family therapy approaches have some good outcomes as well, particularly around substance use. And then, other approaches that fit youth-specific mental health needs are also appropriate. Things like dedicated trauma treatment, prolonged exposure, EMDR, cognitive processing therapy. These are also effective in youth who've experienced trauma, but they have to be safe, right? So youth need to be safe. If the youth is experiencing ongoing trauma, that's a contraindication for doing trauma treatment. I'll touch on that a little bit in a second when I discuss my anecdote. It's not sufficient to provide housing for youth. It's a necessary condition for recovery from mental health challenge, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. It really needs to be joined with other supports, the material condition supports and the appropriate mental health treatment supports. Other things like basic living skills, assistance obtaining and maintaining housing over the long term, financial literacy, all of these things that youth who have had to live on the street may not have had the opportunity to learn how to do. These are skills. We're not born knowing how to do this. And so if the person hasn't learned to do that, then they need assistance in learning how to develop and maintain those skills. You know, when folks are in trauma mode, survival mode, literally just trying to make it through the whole day without getting victimized or abused, they don't have time to acquire these skills, right? I think I've just barely acquired a few and I'm in my 40s. So also flexibility is really critical, right? There needs to be an understanding that we may need to apply a non-linear set of these various approaches depending on where the individual's need is, right? So this is the idea of meeting someone where they are. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So some common characteristics of what this type of holistic intervention might look like is we need to address the population-specific considerations, the psychosocial and mental health implications of housing instability and homelessness, providing physical and psychological safety, and collaboration and mutuality, right? All youth and young adults experiencing homelessness have been failed by adults in their lives. And so it's very important that if we're working with this population, it's in a collaborative, supportive, transparent type of way. So we're not just another adult telling them what to do. We also need to leverage existing evidence-based treatments, as I mentioned before, with things like CBT and trauma-focused interventions. And then material support, right? We simply won't solve the problem without addressing youth and young adults' material needs. So this is holistic, long-term, multidimensional care. You know, there's this idea that if we house youth for like a year and give them some supportive services, that they'll be good to go. This just isn't the case, right? It's going to take longer than a year to just get out of the mindset of fear and trauma. I mean, it can take a really long time to do that. So the idea that somehow youth will be ready to go on their own after a year of support is probably unrealistic. And we can go ahead to the next slide here. So I just want to briefly share a clinical anecdote. So I'm working now with a client. This is an 18-year-old young woman. She doesn't meet the HUD criteria for homelessness, but she had to leave her house because of physical and psychological abuse. She has a trauma history and she's couch surfing. She's kind of bouncing around with different friends. She was living with a boyfriend for a while. The relationship didn't work out. She had to leave. So she's just had temporary housing for about the last year. As I said, couch surfing, etc. But these friends are also themselves financially unstable and insecure. And so it creates strain in the context of those relationships. She has a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, or probably a complex trauma, which is, you know, an ICD-11 mental health diagnosis that kind of mirrors a lot of the BPD symptoms. She has a history of self-harm and suicidality, a lot of relational instability and challenges with trust and setting appropriate boundaries. A couple of strengths though. She is a very hard worker. She's working 2 jobs right now. I'm located in Las Vegas, Nevada. So this young woman is working 2 jobs. She doesn't have a car. She takes public transportation, which is terrible here, to her 2 jobs. She's a full-time student in community college, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, and she's committed to therapy. She never misses an appointment. So this is the picture of someone who would be captured under this slightly broader definition of youth experiencing homelessness. But here's an issue. She's very committed to the work. We're taking a DBT, a dialectical behavior therapy informed approach to her treatment, really focusing initially on psychological safety and physical relaxation. And she was being seen by me under her mother's Medicare insurance. But her mother took her off her Medicare after she moved out. And now the client, because she's working 2 jobs, makes too much money to receive Medicaid, sorry, not Medicare. So she's been now kicked off her Medicaid. She can't pay for therapy. I am seeing her pro bono. This is like a side thing for me. I don't need this money to survive myself. So I'm just seeing her. But this is a problem in our treatment landscape. This is a kid who's doing everything right in school, working 2 jobs, showing up for therapy. She's not able to afford an apartment because they're so expensive, despite working these 2 jobs, but she also makes too much money to get Medicaid to afford treatment. So it's a real catch-22. And frankly, it reveals a massive hole in our social safety net that's going to be hard to address. Nevertheless, in spite of these challenges, she's doing pretty well. We're working on getting her connected to case management and other services so she can afford her own housing. She hasn't had any self-harm behavior or suicide attempts in many months. And we're working on other supports for her, like financial literacy, building a credit history so she can apply for an apartment, all these different things that she didn't have an opportunity to learn in the earlier chaotic period of her experience. So this is just to kind of share a little bit about some of the challenges, what they look like for individuals who kind of meet these criteria. And we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So some key takeaways, this is my last slide. Sorry if I'm going over. So some key takeaways: youth experiencing homelessness come already from socially marginalized groups. Their mental health vulnerabilities often predate homelessness, but those vulnerabilities are exacerbated when they are unsheltered or unstably housed. Homelessness in and of itself is an inherently stressful and traumatic experience. It gets in the way of healthy sleep and nutrition. There's exposure to violence perpetrators and maladaptive coping strategies, and it's very, very difficult to establish and maintain mental health treatment when you're not housed. Effective treatment requires first addressing material conditions. It's unavoidable to do this. It requires appropriate diagnosis and evidence-based treatment. Also requires sustainment over a longer time horizon than I think most folks typically believe. It's going to require holistic, multidimensional supports like life skills training and financial literacy, and flexibility in moving between these domains depending on the individual's needs. So I think the next slide we could go to, and that's just like the discussion and questions. Oh, actually, yeah, we can kind of move through this. I think I'm out of time for the COVID one, so I would just skip this. But basically, COVID made everything worse is the short answer. And yeah, I look forward to any questions or discussion at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that incredible presentation, really informative. And then with that really, that anecdote at the end, I think that really helped to kind of bring together how the systematic problems. Now I'd like to turn it on over to our next speaker, Katie Power, who will be talking from, again, a clinical perspective. Katie Power, she/her, is the Associate Director of Programs at My Friend's Place in Los Angeles, California, and has 14 years experience in the field of social work, primarily working with youth and young adults, and 8.5 years working at My Friend's Place in various positions, including direct youth care, program development, and implementation and clinical leadership. Katie earned her MSW from the University of Southern California and her BA in Journalism and Sociology from the University of Nevada, Reno. Katie is skilled in crisis intervention, clinical consultation, harm reduction, motivational interviewing, and advocating for young people to ensure they receive the care they need and deserve. Katie's approach is person-centered and trauma-informed and centers growth through building relationships, providing community, and encouraging individuality. Katie is also a mom, tattoo collector, and matcha drinker. Please join me in welcoming Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, yeah, we can get into this. We're just gonna kind of expand on what Dr. Barr was sharing. So if you wanna advance to the next slide. Perfect. So common mental health diagnoses by youth facing homelessness. Dr. Barr shared a few that in his presentation, and so I just wanted to go over a few of those and what they might look like. So what does it look like and how do we help? Go ahead to the next one. Okay, depression and anxiety, right? So depression, what does it look like? Persistent sadness or irritability, loss of interest in activities, social withdrawal, changes in appetite or weight, sleep disturbance, fatigue, low energy, feeling worthless or excessive guilt and hopelessness, difficulty thinking, concentrating and making decisions, and sometimes recurrent thoughts of death and suicide. And anxiety looks like excessive anxiety and worry, restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, unexplained physical complaints, kind of like headaches or stomach aches, and sleep disturbance. So something to note here is that a lot of this can also be present if somebody is experiencing homelessness. And so part of the assessment is trying to understand if these are new symptoms that somebody's experiencing because of the impact of homelessness and how they're navigating, and if they're street-based or if they're able to get sleep at somebody's house, or if they're in a shelter, or if they're really up all night just trying to survive. And then really assessing whether or not some of these symptoms were present before to understand if this was going on prior to their experience of homelessness and now are just being exacerbated by their environment. Go on to the next one. Okay, so PTSD, complex trauma, and co-occurring disorders. Again, PTSD, complex trauma can kind of, depending on if there's a single incident or a multiple incidents of trauma, but we know somebody experiencing homelessness is going to be experiencing likely traumatic experiences on a regular basis because of the situation they're in. So what it can look like is emotion regulation. So it may include persistent sadness, suicidal thoughts, explosive anger, or inhibited anger. Consciousness, so includes forgetting traumatic events, reliving traumatic events, having episodes in which one feels detached from one's mental process or body, so called disassociation. Self-perception, they may include helplessness, shame, guilt, stigma, and a sense of being completely different from other human beings. Relations with others, isolation again, distrust, repeated search for a rescuer. And their system of meetings, so may include a loss of faith or sense of hopelessness and despair. So again, that's the impact of trauma. And then co-occurring disorders refers to if somebody has both a diagnosis of mental health, like depression, and also has a diagnosis of substance abuse. So what this can look like is someone who's using substances to manage their mental health symptoms or mask them or alleviate them. Someone who presents with mental health symptoms who also uses substances, or someone who uses substances that eventually leads to or triggers mental health symptoms. And so it can vary by the type of substance that a person is using. But often, like what we see is it's sometimes hard, right? So if somebody is using meth, those symptoms of meth use can also mirror sometimes what psychosis looks like. So again, it's assessment of trying to understand where the symptoms are coming from and what the impact is so that you know how to best intervene. But often, I think, again, like Dr. Barr shared, the use of substances is often related to survival, and a young person may have not used any substances prior to their homelessness, but now feels like this is their best bet at staying up all night, right? Or their best ability to find a place to stay, or their best ability to just manage what they're experiencing and the challenges that they're facing. Okay, on to the next slide. So symptoms of psychosis. So this can look different depending on where the psychosis is kind of coming from. But this is also a big barrier to kind of getting housing and access to mental health treatment and engaging in consistent services. So there can be present with severe depression, psychosis can be present with substance use, or a young person can be experiencing their first break that may lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia. In that age range that we're talking about, like 18 to 24 young adults, that is like a prime time for when something like this could happen. So just some basics of psychosis, and again, there's a whole lot more to it, but hallucinations, so these are auditory, visual, olfactory. The hallucinations are very real to the person experiencing it. They can be commanding, they can be critical or threatening. The voices may belong to someone known or unknown to the person as well. And delusions, so these are false beliefs that don't change even when presented with new ideas or facts. They can coincide with problems concentrating, disordered perceptions, confused thinking, or thought blocking. So some early signs to watch for if you're working with folks that you may think may be impacted or developing some symptoms is there's kind of an increase in unusual thoughts or perceptions, confusion about reality. They may be more isolated from social connections or any other connections. So different than maybe how they have normally navigated. They start to isolate from peers or even their providers or support systems. A decline in personal hygiene. So something that we see often that's like a really big factor is like somebody will put their hood up and they'll start to just pull it tighter and tighter as the days go on, and they're just not really wanting to like expose their face or be around others. And their hygiene is declining, meaning that if somebody was once really good at, taking care of their hygiene and they start to decline, they're not taking showers anymore, this could be a first sign. Again, disorganized behavior and thoughts can look different for different people, and an increased or new sensitivity to light or sound. So these are just some early signs to watch for. Go ahead into the next slide. Okay, so early experiences with mental health. Often a youth's first experience with mental health symptoms or treatment was not trauma-informed. So this is setting them up to not want to engage with the providers as they maybe turn 18 and they're now adults and they're trying to navigate the system and trying to get help. But a lot of times the experiences they had as a youth or a child were traumatic in themselves and not encouraging of continued help and support. So treatment or support was forced and punitive. It disregarded principles of recovery and trauma. The diagnosis was used to stigmatize and wasn't explained and only treated with medication. Oftentimes young people will come into the space and they'll say, oh, I have all these diagnoses, and they'll list like 10 different diagnoses that they've received over the course of their childhood. Lots of them conflicting, not necessarily making sense, maybe not accurate anymore. And so there's just a lot of confusion around it. And maybe they were just given medication when they were younger and not really explained the whole situation or given other tools to use. They developed negative and incomplete self-concept based on diagnosis that limited potential, right? They were given a diagnosis and then that means like, oh, you are this thing, so now you're not going to be able to do these other things, which is not true. Made young people feel defective rather than empowered. Again, like I said, multiple diagnoses are given throughout their lives, making it really confusing to understand. Labeling and assumptions based on diagnosis when seeking help in the future. And an intervention was not sustainable or not offer a clear path forward depending on resources and support. So basically whatever intervention was given, it might not have worked for that young person at that time. And so it was not able to be able to really stick and help them move forward to the next step. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how do we engage for a repair experience, a trauma-informed response? We focus on psychoeducation about the root causes of symptoms and behaviors through a trauma-informed lens. We remove the stigma by explaining how behaviors and symptoms are a normal response to traumatic experiences, systems of oppression, and intergenerational trauma. And we empower young people to make choices about their mental health and care, employ harm reduction and motivational interviewing along the way. We promote the idea that our mental health is multidimensional and will experience periods of wellness and periods of unwellness, and that this is most often influenced by the world around us. Provide daily support that reinforces coping skills to help young people get through a moment of struggle, and reinforces help-seeking behavior as a sign of personal strength, not weakness, and promote community healing. Next slide. So again, to just talk a little bit more, so connection. Building rapport and attachment with young people offers them a relationship with a provider where they can have a healing and repair through trust and clear boundaries. So here at My Friend's Place, we use the ARC model, which is attachment, regulation, and competency. And there's many other places that use this model as well. But it really supports building that attachment and building the rapport as like a crucial first step. And then being able to have that healing relationship, meaning we can set the boundaries, we can explain things differently, we can support a young person in a way that's trauma informed to hopefully show a different way of accessing support and healing the past traumas that have happened. And again, the regulation part is co-regulation, right? We're supporting and showing how we regulate together and providing in the moment regulation when crisis occurs and building their competency. Community is also a really big factor for young people. Groups and spaces where young people can be around other youth helps to reduce isolation and feelings that they're alone in their struggle or that they're the only one maybe experiencing something. That space also is a place to uphold healthy boundaries, but are also flexible and open to mistakes. So understanding that young people are going to make mistakes, as we all have and we all do, and being able to hold boundaries, you know, those consequences, natural consequences that happen, but also reminding and giving space that they're welcome and that we can move on to the next thing. We can keep working together. And I've definitely been in community and group spaces where young people are maybe sharing about something that's happened to them. And another young person is like, oh my gosh, I didn't know anybody else thought that way. I didn't know anybody felt that way. So those community and group spaces are really important for young people, for their development, and for also just creating a space to know that they're not alone. So we can also support with the referral for psychiatric medications if symptoms are severe. A lot of young people are not wanting to take medication, and it's understandable because they were likely given medication and they didn't want it as a youth. And so it's easy to understand why they may not want to take medication now as an adult when they have the choice. But really it's utilizing in some cases, the psychiatric medication can offer a stabilization that allows for the young person to differently engage in resources and goals. And by having that trust and that attachment, you're able to have a open conversation about, you know, what are the impacts, what's, you know, getting in the way of being able to take this step, and being able to know that it's a choice and you can stop if you want, but maybe you try it. So definitely have seen situations where medication can help with stabilization so that they can feel well enough to be able to move through their goals and take the next step. So supporting with safety planning, harm reduction, and again, open conversation. Helping the young person identify areas of risk and how to create safety with limited resources or connections. Being open and honest about risks and concerns and impacts. So this is about just, you know, we're talking, oh, sorry, can you go back to the page? I think it's flowing through. Okay, so yeah, so I think this is just about being open and honest. So when a young person is experiencing risks and they're not sure how to create safety for themselves, being honest about what those risks are, being honest about the safety making and the limited resources they may have. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And just as the provider or the support person, really being honest about it, with being open with it as well. So naming things is okay, and you don't have to shy away from naming risk factors. And then starting where they're at and offering psychoeducation to build awareness. So building a young person's awareness around coping skills, risks, and maladaptive behaviors so that they can identify areas where making a different choice might be possible to disrupt cycles. So being able to share the information with them so that they know what their choices are and they can make a different choice and have the support to make different choices. Okay, on to the next slide. So these are just some reminders and tips for engaging with youth. So just reminding yourself or remembering that the young person is the expert of their life. So if you're a provider, you're not coming in as the expert, you're coming in as the support person, and the young person is the expert of their life. We can support and guide, but they're ultimately going to make their own choices, and developmentally, this is where they're at. So establishing their own identity and challenging societal norms is where they're supposed to be. And then we recognize as service providers, we're only present for a small portion of a young person's life, and that we often don't know or won't know the full extent of their day and everything that they're facing. So what we do know is that young people are resilient, and we can help them build their knowledge and skills for navigating challenges and keep presenting opportunities and options for growth and change. It's helpful to lead with learning and understanding the youth and how they utilize resources and how they've gotten through challenges in the past, instead of leading with advice or taking the stance that you know better. And again, taking high-risk behavior seriously and naming it so it can be talked about, and harm reduction or safety planning can happen in a real way. Okay, next slide. Okay, risk assessments and safety planning. So some of the challenges with risk assessments and safety planning with youth experiencing homelessness include, so this is, right, so suicidality is the number one risk factor or cause of death for youth experiencing homelessness. So when we're doing those risk assessments and we're safety planning with them, there are some challenges because of the circumstances in the situation. So there's a higher chance of them interacting with police when they're street-based. There's a risk for suicide by cop or a negative interaction with police rather than a therapeutic intervention. When they're attempting to self-hospitalize, if it's shared that the youth is homeless, their SI can be seen as a way to get a bed, making it harder to get care. So rather than being seen as a real threat to their life, hospitals may believe that, oh, this person is just trying to sleep inside somewhere tonight. The lack of social system and support to create safety making. So they don't have maybe the same systems in place that somebody that is housed or is still connected with their family, because often young people are disconnected from their families and systems that could be supportive. And so it's really hard to make a safety plan and create that safety. And then lack of access to technology, often having a phone that only works with Wi-Fi or no phone at all, limiting safety planning and the use of crisis hotlines. So there's lots of really great crisis lines out there, but often a young person just doesn't have that access to a regular phone that's working, or maybe they didn't get it charged during the day somewhere, so at night they don't have a charged phone. And often young people are using phones that have Wi-Fi access only and not actual service. So that can be limiting when you're making safety plans. And then again, isolation, lack of community, depending on mental health and other circumstances. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just kind of my last slide here, but I wanted to mention this again. I'm in California, so this is our minor consent law here, but you should check your state and see what the minor consent laws are. But here in California, minors 12 and older can consent to mental health treatment or counseling without a parent or guardian's consent if they meet certain requirements. So the minor is mature enough to participate in the treatment. The treatment is outpatient or residential shelter services, and they're not in serious danger of physical or mental harm and are the alleged victim of incest or child abuse. So the goal of this law is to break down barriers to care and ensure the youth's safety and well-being. It's important to note that the minor's access to care from a trusted professional may help build a healthy connection between the minor and their parent or guardian. So often we have minors coming into our drop-in space here. They're welcome to come here. They're able to meet with a social worker here on site, and they're able to consent to their treatment here, and their treatment meaning that they can get their basic needs met, they can have someone to talk to. And really the goal there is to explore what's going on. If we have a mandate to make, it's really partnering with them on that mandate and really focusing in on creating safety for them and how we can help them get to back to a place of safety and hopefully prevent homelessness in their future. And that's all I have. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Katie. Our third and final presenter, I'm very excited to hear from, Arc Telos Saint Amour, person of Mexican Native Indigenous descent, Kwa Will Tekan, and a victim survivor of childhood trauma who deeply believes in self-agency and bodily autonomy. They are formerly gang involved, justice and other system impacted, and consider themselves to be a peer supporter and a harm reductionist as part of the co-occurring serious mental illness and substance use recovery journey. This lived and living experience has led them to a deep belief in Native Indigenous animism, radical empathy, and the power of holistic affirmation. Professionally, Arc Telos spent over 10 years as a national executive business developer, opening new businesses all over the US. Following this, Arc Telos spent another 10 years as an executive leader in the nonprofit field, leading organizations throughout the nation using trauma-informed and intersectionality-based frameworks. Currently, they are the executive director of Youth Move National, deeply involved in youth advocacy and engagement, and the CEO of AT Consulting, as well as involved in several boards, Black and Pink, 4upage.org, Unified Youth. Telos is, of course, more than just their career and identities. They are deeply passionate about all genres of music, documentaries, hiking, and other outdoor adventures, in which they are infamous for achieving minor injuries and the loss of shoes, and absolutely refusing to be anyone other than Princess Peach in Mario Kart or Mario Party, which I can understand. Please join me in welcoming Arc, and I'm going to end the slideshow so that we can see you and appreciate you fully.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I super appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around. I know we're at the top of the hour. I do not have a fancy slide deck prepared for you. All you get to see is my pretty face because, you know, I am someone who is exactly what Dr. Barr and Nick was talking about. I'm exactly what Katie was just talking about. I was that systems impacted youth, and I'm still that systems impacted adult. And so I think instead of trying to share a little bit about my research or a little bit about Youth Move National and what I do, I thought I'd just share a little bit about me and my direct lived and living experience with experiencing exactly what we're here to talk about today. So as Vanessa shared, hello everyone. My name is Arc Telos Saint Amour. It is a very long name, so most folks call me Tay, but actually any combination of my name feels good and honoring to me. And I usually tell people that, you know, for better or for worse, mainly worse, I was literally born into trauma and literally born into being systems impacted. And before I jump into that story, I do just want to offer a content warning. I'm going to be real honest with my experience, and that's going to cover heavy topics, using heavy words, but I'm going to lean into it, and I'm going to use those words instead of trying to use acronyms. So if you need to self-care, please self-care. But I wanted to be here just to tell you my own story so we can put a face, we can put a name, we can do some person-first and human-centered design around a lot of the statistics and research that we just talked about. Because I hope you realize already from these two amazing presentations and this research that has been done and these statistics that this is important, it's scary, it's dangerous, it's harmful, but we're more than numbers, we're people. We're more than headlines, we're people. Like, hi, I am one of those people, right? So I want to share that full story with you. So if you need to self-care throughout, please do so. But as I started to share, right, I was born into being systems impacted, and I was born into being to trauma. So when I was born, my biological parent, who was Mexican Native and Indigenous, was deported back to Mexico. So I already started off without having full parental support. The remaining adults in my life struggled with their own co-occurring serious mental illness, their own substance use, their own inexperience. A lot of the adults in my life were extremely young, and it did not create a healthy, happy, affirming environment. And so oftentimes I find myself engaged with CPS, Child Protective Services, the foster care child welfare system, adoption services, things of that nature. And between both of those systems of CPS and child welfare and the natural supports, those natural entrusted adults that I had, they were all very violent. And these are just I statements. This is my experience. I'm not saying that this is universal for everybody, but it didn't matter who I was with. It didn't matter what the adults were or what the system was. I faced very serious emotional, physical, and sexual harm and violence and rape. And that was, very, very early on in my experience. And so it was a struggle for me to find love, care, affirmation, community, all of those things, right? All of those things that is very much so inherent in the human experience, right? All of us want love and affirmation and community, right? Although that's an absolute, I believe all of us want that, right? But especially for our youth, right? Especially for our kids. We know the science, we know the research, we know what happens when youth aren't provided that, right? We know what trauma can do. Y'all just heard about it, right? You just listened to 55 minutes of all the things that can happen when those things aren't provided. And that was me. Like, I am the product of what happens when those things aren't provided, right? And so really in a area of desperation, I ended up being houseless for the majority of my youth in the first 20 years of my life, although I have experienced bouts of houselessness as an adult as well. For a lot of us, we live paycheck to paycheck. For a lot of us, we're, a medical visit away from being houseless, and we don't often think about that. Or maybe we do often think about that, but we don't often verbalize that, right? Maybe that's a hidden secret among a lot of our experiences as adults. But for me as a youth, I found it much safer to spend time, on my friends' couches, to spend time at their dining room tables, to spend time at the place in which I would have to work in order to have food security. I would sleep on the floor of my places of employment. I would sleep out of my car, at a van I often slept in, and oftentimes, yes, literally sleeping on the streets. And so all of that, as y'all heard it, it really equaled a sense of desperation. When you experience that level of violence and trauma and abandonment, the desperation that comes with that, the helplessness, the hopelessness, it's tangible, it's palpable, it's constant, it's never ending, right? And I think that was one of the reasons certainly that led to my substance use. And I still am on a substance use sort of recovery journey, if you will. But yeah, I was a heavy user, both as a method of survival, right? If you're sleeping on the streets, you really have to stay awake a lot of the time. So theft, violence, all of the things occur. I was trying to still graduate high school as best as possible while working full time. Like that requires a lot of a lack of sleep, right? And that, so certain substances really, really helped me with that. Not only just using to survive, but also to cope as well. And so that's a lot of where my substance use came from. And then as far as just that desperation, I really tried to find that sense of love and affirmation and community in many different ways. And, honestly, I did find it among a great group of friends who were all brilliant and really helped me in their own ways. They helped me graduate high school, which was a pretty big miracle, honestly, and something that was a huge privilege for me. So I had a group of peers that helped me in certain elements. But as Vanessa shared my long bio, right, which I never get used to hearing that long thing, right? But as a disabled queer and trans person of color, like, I was dealing with so much more than even just my substance use and houselessness and trauma and violence that was occurring. And so I was still looking for that love and affirmation and community. And I found it in other places, which included a gang, right? So I ended up joining a street gang, which, we oftentimes don't talk about, but those do serve a need, right? It does serve a lapse in some inner cities, in some communities, as far as stability when it comes to housing and employment and food, when it comes to stability as far as community and affirmation and support of who folks are. Now, be it, yes, it is shrouded in a lot of harm and a lot of violence, both to myself and, of course, to others. And so that inevitably is when the carceral system entered my life, so I'm definitely criminal legal system impacted, juvenile justice system impacted. But something that was really brilliant and amazing about that time was formal peer support. That is really when sort of the formal peer support entered my life. And I started to see a path open up that was a little different than the paths that I thought were only available to me or that I had to go down. And I've been following that path ever since. And, some things don't change. I'm still a systems impacted adult. I still have co-occurring serious mental illness. I still am on a substance use journey. I still very much so deal with harm and violence and abandonment and all of those things. But the new path that peer support gave me really is one that I think has led to the best outcomes, outcomes I couldn't even imagine when I was a youth. I mean, if I look at the person I was 2, 3, 12, 13, 18, even 24, I couldn't imagine I'd be able to have the amount of privilege and the life that I have today, even though I still deal with systemic oppression from all of my identities and my lived and living experience. And so just wanted to highlight the power of peer support. So I know we're excited to get into the Q&A session, but I had 20 minutes, so I'll try to use my time. So I do want to share broad overview of my life and my experience, but I want to share a specific story that gets to the heart of some of the things that we talked about, right? We had some of those clinician case studies. We had a lot of that research and statistics. I want to give you a real story. I want to give you a real story from someone who experienced it. So here I am, traumatized kid, right? I think I'm about 3 or 4 at the time, going through immense violence and harm, physical, sexual, all of the things. And we had a wonderful program come into like inner city schools, right? Where they got to sort of offer the kids a program, right? So you could choose art, you could choose dance, you could choose music, you could choose different things. So wonderful program. And I was selected for it, and I chose ballet. And I chose ballet for a really hyper-specific reason, because I was a queer and trans kid, and I wanted to wear the pink dress. I wanted to be a princess, right? Which is the Princess Peach in Mario Kart and Mario Party, which is true, right? And so I had this wonderful opportunity, right, to really feel holistically and authentically like myself. I was given as a youth agency. I was given agency and self-determination to pick something that could just be mine, that was only for me, to feel seen and loved, and to do something that I wanted to do. So I got to be a princess in ballet. Until, right? Yet, the power of yet, until I made the mistake of telling the adults in which I was placed with at the time the reason why I chose ballet, right? It was a conversation about getting excited for my recital coming up. And I shared, yeah, I'm super excited. I get to finally be a princess. That's why I chose to do it, because I get to wear the pink dress and the tutu. And that was literally and figuratively beaten out of me. And so when we talk about the power of trauma and violence, we look at these statistics as far as, disproportionate to us LGBTQI plus facing houselessness and substance use and suicidality and all of these things. It's not because we're inherently broken. It's not because there are things that are wrong with us. It's not because we are unnatural. It is because society and systems teaches our adults, teaches us that for some reason this should be devalued to the point of violence. And things like what happened to me occur. I am taught systematically that adults and systems are not safe. And I am safer by myself and on the streets, right? Which has led, at least for me, my I statements, to my substance use, right? And it was a big struggle to get the help and resources I needed. And I had some privileges to be able to get some formal diagnoses. I have 6 very serious emotional disturbance and six diagnoses as far as serious mental illness, and probably way more. It's kind of a funny quote. My clinician told me that, like, we're going to stop at 6. I could probably give you more, but let's just kind of tap out at 6, right? And having those formal diagnoses gives me resources. It gives me access to treatment. And it also gives me some disadvantages, right? It gives me a disadvantage in a lot of different fields, right? In employment, in certain areas in which it's actually helpful not to have diagnoses, right? And so I also really just want to uplift folks who don't have that access to have formal diagnoses, right? There's some privileges that come with it, but there's also some disadvantages. So there is power in us being our own experts. There is power in us knowing ourselves better than literally anyone, and we don't need a doctor or a clinician or a PhD or someone to tell us who we are. We know who we are, and we should be proud of that, right? And the challenges that we face, we should define what those are. We should define what our challenges are and what our goals are. And that's what I think is so beautiful about peer support, right? Is they don't take self-agency or self-determination away. They help listen. They help guide you. They give you hope, right? So I hope telling a little bit of my story helps contextualize all this number and data. So how do we bring it back to some of those things? Because I was taking notes, because they're brilliant presentations. I love them all. And so when it comes to some of the things Dr. Barr or Nick was talking about, right, I think my story is a prime example of that disproportionality when it comes to 2S LGBTQI+, again, facing houselessness, suicidality, substance use, having co-occurring serious mental illness. Again, not because we're broken, because we're facing these disproportionate rates of trauma, right? And so I'm a living example of how these statistics can play out in good ways and in bad ways, right? When we don't support folks where it's really needed. And, you know, Katie shared a lot about sort of the symptoms that come from trauma and how adults and systems can re-traumatize, right? And a kid, I'm a sort of living example, and I just was sort of laughing to it's bizarre to hear sort of your life talked about in third person, right, as a statistic. But I was just kind of laughing because if you think about what our society and our system does, right? I'm a kid, literally born into trauma, no fault of my own. And because of that violence and trauma, essentially, I develop a sickness. And instead of me, you know, being treated with love and affirmation and community and some sort of like, we're so sorry, we treated you so poorly through no fault of your own that you developed this sickness and now you're sick. But that's okay. We've got you now. We're going to take care of you. The symptoms of my sickness actually double down on the oppression. It doubles down on the unfairness, right? As someone who lives with very severe BPD or borderline personality disorder, all you have to do is open a book about people with borderline personality disorder, and you will read very quickly that we are just deemed as unreliable, unworthy, ungrateful, angry, violent criminals that no one should ever have a relationship with because we are just unredeemable. And why? Why? Because I'm exhibiting symptoms of violence and trauma. I'm exhibiting symptoms of my sickness, and we can heal. We can move forward. There is a recovery narrative there, right? And so I just wanted to uplift not only my story, but again, the amazing work that Nick and Katie talked about and how we can kind of bring it full circle with my story and sort of some of those things that I picked up on and that I saw. So, all right, I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to end it there so we could get into the Q&A. But I just appreciate y'all being here and listening to my story and holding space for me and my fellow co-presenters and Vanessa and everybody else. So thank y'all so much for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Just looking at the chat, you can see how much it resonated with folks. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If all of the presenters, feel free to turn on your videos if you would like, so that we can kind of move through. Lots of great questions came through. I'd like to start with one that I think covers multiple questions and is a question of mine, which is about system integration. And so in advance of the seminar, somebody asked, how can service systems better coordinate to address both housing instability and mental health needs? With several questions asking about things like schools or employment systems. Are there any particular systems where we see people kind of falling through the cracks? How can systems work better together? Or are there systems that we're not thinking about where we could place interventions to really help meet youth where they're at? And that's open to whoever would like to take it.
I don't mind jumping in just rather quickly. I can give again a sort of a lived-in living experience answer, and my colleagues here, I'm sure, can give their sort of perspectives from their areas. But for me, I think yes, it is so important, systems integration and cross-systems partnership. So incredibly important, and we can look at system of care, right? But both in uppercase letter and in lowercase letter. So systems of care, I think, sets out a really good example of how ideally cross-systems partnerships and systems integration could look. Because it has to be all of the things, literally all the things. It needs to be your clinician, your peer supporter, your adult supports, your primary care doctor, your school and education, your truancy officer, if you have a probation officer, places of employment. I mean, if we're seeing trauma coming from a lack of community, well, then community is the answer, and community means everybody, right? And so that system of care philosophy, I think, is on paper a good one. Now here is my and to all of that. And it often doesn't work. And why it doesn't work can be debated and talked about, and we all have probably our own thoughts and opinions on that, right? But I think we often lose sight of that, like, systems do oppress. I mean, I'm Native Indigenous, right? We're under settler colonialism. Systems inherently oppress. But systems are still made of people. They're not always the invisible boogeyman. And so you can get people within systems that are brilliant and that are amazing and that will help you every step of the way, or you can get people who will be detrimental and re-traumatize and can actually ruin the entire process, right? That the bad apple spoils the bunch. That's the rest of it, right? It spoils the bunch. And as we look at things such as the executive orders, things that are coming out of our current political landscape, it's being criminalized. So you have to keep that in mind. And some of these folks are mandated reporters. So as we want to talk about system integration and cross-systems partnership as a good thing, because if it works, it is. If it's illegal for me to be me, I can't engage with that system if they're mandated reporters. I tell one person, it goes through the whole thing, and guess what? I'm back in lockup. So we have to be careful about the policies and legislation and laws that are happening at the same time that we're trying to do some of these practices. Because not only sometimes are they not connecting, but they are mutually exclusive, and then they will create more harm. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much for, I think, sharing the complexity of that question, right? I appreciate that. If others want to answer that as well, that's great. I do know we only have 10 minutes. So instead of asking another question, I actually wanted to leave it up to the presenters to answer any questions that they've seen come through that really resonated with them. So if you want to say more to the questions that I just asked, that's fine. If there's something else that you've seen and you wanted to respond to, I also wanted to make sure there was that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add there is just that in my experience, even in systems that are well developed and like the housing queue that we have here, and agencies that have a lot of resources and do a good job getting folks connected. There really just does have to be like one person, in my experience, whether it's a case manager or the therapist or somebody, one person who ultimately takes responsibility for helping the individual navigate, the systems that they're trying to navigate. The buck has to stop somewhere. And that's how I've seen things be effective. Typically, if there's not one individual, or if like that person leaves and goes to another job or whatever, this is where you see problems crop up and the person kind of get lost. And, often it's going to take a lot of follow-up. It's inherently unstable. You're inherently unstable if you are missing a safe place to stay every night. It's hard to get your phone charged. It's hard to access services. Transportation is a problem, all this stuff. So, if the person misses 2 appointments and you don't hear from them and you just do this, that's not a way to do treatment, right? You need to understand that working with the population is going to require going above and beyond. And, having a caseload of 120 people is probably not going to be conducive to that type of sustained follow-up. So, I think nobody gets in this field to get rich from a service provision perspective. Everyone is in here because they want to do the right thing and help people. But just the kind of practicalities demand that, you have one person who bears ultimate responsibility, and that person really shouldn't have too many cases because it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. I do think this is just a place where there just is so much work to be done of like how the systems collaborate, because lots of people are falling through the cracks, and it's very easy for young people to fall through. I think where I'm at is at a drop-in center, and we often are that kind of like glue getting people reconnected, because it is a space where folks can freely come every day. And a lot of the work we're doing is reconnecting them back to maybe a service provider that was working on the housing, that was doing the therapy, that was doing the school, whatever it is that they've lost contact with, and we're an easy place to come, where they're coming every day. So if somebody's looking for them, they can find them here usually. So I do think that those types of spaces, like community spaces, can be beneficial with helping get people connected. But I think the system in general is just, they're not talking to each other. So it's very easy for you to have a case manager at one place and a provider someplace else, and maybe they haven't spoken or consents haven't been signed for them to speak. And so they maybe are working on the same thing or different things. And the young person might be confused because it's a lot of information and it's a lot of different paperwork that has to be completed in so many spaces as well. So I do think that this is just an area of growth for probably the states, the cities, where the resources just, there needs to be more collaboration among the agencies and the resources, so that there isn't such an easy way to kind of fall out of touch with people and get lost.
Thank you so much. There are so many questions coming through, and I wish that we had time to answer them all. Unfortunately, we don't. We'll need a full day for this seminar next time. I want to leave the speakers with an opportunity, if there's anything, having looked through the questions, anything that you want to say kind of in closing, that you hope folks are able to take away or understand from today's presentation in just the last few minutes that we have. And if you're not sure, the one other question that I really wanted to get to was about trust. How can providers build trust? And how do we make sure that we're not losing trust along the journey? So either way you want to end.
Yeah, there's so many, it's hard to prioritize. I would just say really briefly that and this is kind of trying to bridge my research and clinical experience here, you can't be effective in helping somebody if they don't want to come see you. So you might really think that, the thing that they want to work on isn't the priority, or they don't want to do the thing that you think is so important. But if they don't want to come see you, they won't get better. So there really, I think from a service provision perspective, needs to be an understanding that even if you don't think the work that you're doing is like number one priority, and yet it's the thing that the individual wants to do, you're building a relationship. And without the relation, I know people say this all the time, rapport building, the relationship, but like practically what that means is being able to manage your own internal anxiety about the need to do things in service of helping the person feel connected to you. So if my person comes in, I'm like, hey, I really want to talk about housing. I'm worried about this. We got to talk, how do we get you back on Medicaid, da, da, da. And my client's like, that's important, but I just had this fight with my boyfriend and I'm really upset about it. I can't think about anything else. That's what we're going to talk about, because that will make her feel connected and safe and that I'm there for her. And then down the road, we'll be able to work on some of these other things. But you have to let the youth set the agenda to some extent in service of building the relationship. So I would just say that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also just any opportunities where there's repair, where you can acknowledge like, oh, I made a mistake here. Let me apologize for it. That builds the relationship as well. And yeah, just really hearing where they're at and letting them lead the way. And you're there for the support, and you're there to help guide and give opportunities and options. But like I said, like the young person is the expert of their life, and they get to make the choices. We can be there to support and help and give them different options that they might have not known about, given their circumstances.
Yeah, and I fully agree with everything my co-presenter said. So I'll just really sort of double down on that. Self-determination, self-agency is so important. As youth, it's constantly taken away from us. So we look for that. We look for the need for that. Decentering yourself and centering them, like that's why we're here. So take care of them, to serve them, not to serve you, not to serve your agenda, right? And we notice that. We notice when adults do that. And I would say, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Like being honest, being authentic and holistically yourself, being able to be vulnerable about those things that you know and that you don't know. When you're nervous and scared, vulnerability builds trust, and it builds authentic relationships. And youth are really good at seeing through BS. So I think it'll help everybody in the long run. So thank you.
Well, again, I just want to thank our fantastic presenters for all of the information that they shared. I know I learned so much, and I hope that others who attended did as well. In our last minute, I'll turn it back on over for a few words about evaluation and yeah.
Thank you so much. Just from the bottom of our hearts, this was such an engaging 90 minutes. It went very fast. I concur with everybody in the comments. I want you to speak all day, so we're gonna have to find a way to make that happen. So huge thanks to the panelists today. We do have a QR code and a link in the chat for an evaluation and a certificate of participation. And just so everybody knows, all of the great feedback you are giving in the Q&A and on the surveys, we make sure that the panelists get those, because it's important. It's important to hear when we're hitting the mark and what resonated with you. So thank you for that. So with that, thank you all for joining us. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you next time.